She said they had no service up in the mountains. Then I got a call from a ranger. We found your wife's phone in a guy's tent. I should have known something was off when she started packing for this camping trip 3 weeks in advance. My wife never plans anything that far ahead. She's the type who decides what to have for dinner while standing in front of the open fridge. But there she was, making lists, buying new hiking boots, even researching the weather patterns for some remote spot in the mountains. She told me it was going to be her, along with 2 girlfriends from her book club. They wanted to disconnect from everything for a long weekend, just nature and good conversation. I thought it sounded great actually. She'd been stressed lately, working longer hours, seeming distant. Maybe some time with the girls would help her reset. The morning she left, she kissed me goodbye and reminded me again about the no-service thing. She said she'd try to check in when they drove through small towns, but not to worry if I didn't hear from her. I watched her load her brand new camping gear into the car, waved goodbye, and settled in for a weekend of dad duty with our 2 kids. Friday came and went without any word. I wasn't worried. She'd warned me about the service. Saturday morning, I took the kids to their soccer games, made pancakes for lunch, and tried to keep busy. By Saturday evening, I was starting to feel that familiar knot in my stomach that comes when something doesn't feel right, but I pushed it down. She said no service, I told myself. Stop being paranoid. Sunday morning changed everything. My phone rang at 7:23 a.m. Unknown number with a local area code I recognized, but couldn't place. I almost didn't answer. Who calls that early on a Sunday? But something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was official, measured. A park ranger from one of the national forests about 4 hours north of us. He said they'd found a phone registered to my wife after breaking up an illegal camping situation. The phone had been left behind in a man's tent when they issued citations for camping in a restricted area. My blood turned to ice. I asked him to repeat what he'd said, certain I'd misunderstood. But no, he was very clear. One phone, registered to my wife, found in a tent belonging to a single male camper. No mention of any book club friends. No mention of any other women at all. I woke the kids up, threw some clothes in a bag, and called my mother-in-law to come watch them. I told her there was an emergency, but didn't elaborate. The 4-hour drive to the national park felt like the longest journey of my life. My mind raced through every possible explanation. Maybe she'd lost her phone and this guy found it. Maybe the girlfriends had left early and she'd gotten a ride with someone else. Maybe there was some completely innocent explanation that would make me feel stupid for driving all this way. But deep down I knew. The way she'd been acting lately, the distance between us, the careful planning for this trip, it all started making a different kind of sense. The ranger station sat at the entrance to the park, a small wooden building surrounded by towering pines. The ranger who'd called me was middle-aged, kind-faced, clearly uncomfortable with the situation he'd found himself in. He handed me her phone, the case I'd bought her for Christmas, the screen protector slightly cracked from when she'd dropped it last month. He explained that they'd gotten reports of illegal camping in a restricted area known for its fragile ecosystem. When they'd hiked in to investigate, they'd found a single tent set up near a protected stream. The man inside had been cooperative, packed up quickly when asked to leave, but in his rush, he'd left behind a few items including the phone. I asked about other campers, about any women who might have been with him. The ranger shook his head. Just the one guy, middle-aged, said his name was something with AT. They'd issued him a citation and sent him on his way before they'd discovered the phone. The ranger offered to give me directions to where they'd found the campsite. It was only accessible by foot, about a 2-mile hike on a trail that wasn't even marked on most maps. As I walked that trail, my heart pounded with each step. Part of me hoped I wouldn't find anything, that this would all turn out to be some bizarre misunderstanding. But another part of me, the part that had been noticing all those little changes in my wife over the past few months, knew I was about to learn something that would change everything. The campsite was in a small clearing beside a crystal-clear stream. Beautiful, secluded, romantic even. The kind of place you'd take someone if you wanted complete privacy. I found a few items scattered around that the campers had left behind. A water bottle, some granola bar wrappers, and something that made my stomach drop. One of my wife's hair ties. The bright blue one she always wore, the one I'd watched her put in her hair that morning before she left. I sat by that stream for a long time, trying to process what I discovered. My wife of 8 years, the mother of my children, had lied to me. She hadn't gone camping with girlfriends. She'd come to this remote, beautiful place with another man. The evidence was undeniable. The drive home was a blur of emotions. Anger, hurt, confusion, and underneath it all, a growing sense of betrayal that felt like a physical weight in my chest. I picked up the kids from my mother-in-law's house, gave them dinner, put them to bed, and waited. She came home Sunday night around 9, full of stories about her wonderful weekend with the girls. She looked refreshed, happy even, with a slight sunburn on her nose and dirt still under her fingernails. She hugged me and asked about the kids, complained about how tired she was from all the hiking they'd done. I watched her perform this elaborate charade, talking about inside jokes with her book club friends, describing the campfire they'd built, even showing me a photo on her phone, which she'd apparently recovered from wherever she'd dropped it during the trip. Every word felt like another cut. I didn't confront her that night. I needed time to think, to figure out what I was going to do with this information. But sleep was impossible. I lay awake next to her, listening to her breathe, wondering how long this had been going on and what else she'd lied about. Update 1. The next few days were torture. I went through the motions of normal life. Work, dinners, bedtime routines with the kids. While inside, I was falling apart. Every time she spoke to me, every casual kiss goodbye, every mundane conversation about schedules and groceries felt like I was living in some alternate reality. I started paying attention to details I'd missed before. Her phone habits had changed months ago. She'd started keeping it face down, taking it with her to the bathroom, stepping outside to take certain calls. She'd also started working out more, buying new clothes, taking more care with her appearance. At the time, I'd been happy about it, thought maybe she was just taking better care of herself. Now those changes felt like evidence of something much more painful. By Wednesday, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers, but I also needed to be smart about this. I had 2 kids to think about, a mortgage, a whole life we'd built together. I couldn't just explode without understanding the full scope of what I was dealing with. I decided to do some investigating. I started with her phone records. We shared a family plan, so I had access to the account online. What I found there made everything so much worse. Hundreds of text messages to a number I didn't recognize, dating back almost 6 months. Long phone calls, often late at night after I'd gone to bed or early in the morning before I woke up. I tried to reverse search the number, but came up empty. It was registered to someone, but I couldn't find out who without paying for a more detailed report. The timing of the messages told its own story, though. Clusters of communication that intensified in the weeks leading up to her camping trip, then a gap during the weekend, then a flood of messages starting Sunday night after she got home. But here's where things got really twisted. I noticed another pattern in the phone records. This wasn't the first camping trip. Over the past 6 months, there had been several weekends where her phone had pinged towers in remote locations, places that didn't match up with what she'd told me she was doing. A book club retreat that had apparently taken place in a small mountain town 3 hours away. A spa weekend with her sister that had involved cell towers near a lake in the opposite direction from where her sister lived. My wife wasn't just having an affair, she was a master at it. Every lie had been carefully crafted, every alibi perfectly constructed. I started to wonder if I'd ever really known her at all. Thursday evening, she announced another trip. This time it was a work conference, supposedly mandatory, in a city about 5 hours away. She'd be gone Friday through Sunday. As she talked about the boring sessions she'd have to attend and the awful hotel food she'd have to endure, I watched her face carefully. She was good at this, I had to give her that. If I hadn't known what I knew, I would have believed every word. I made a decision that probably wasn't smart, but I was beyond caring about smart. I was going to follow her. Friday morning, I called in sick to work and arranged for my mother-in-law to watch the kids again. I told her I wasn't feeling well and needed to rest, which wasn't entirely a lie. I felt sick to my stomach most of the time now. An hour after my wife left for her supposed conference, I got in my car and started following the route her phone was taking. For the first 2 hours, she drove in the direction of the city she'd mentioned. My heart started to sink. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe this really was a work thing. But then her signal made a sharp turn onto a highway I wasn't expecting. Instead of continuing toward the conference city, she was heading back into the mountains. I followed at a distance, stopping periodically to check her location on the family tracking app we'd set up months earlier for safety reasons. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was using a safety feature to track my wife's infidelity. Her final destination was a small cabin resort about 3 hours from our house, nestled in a valley I'd never heard of. The kind of place that advertised itself as a romantic getaway for couples looking to reconnect. When I pulled into the parking area and saw her car parked next to a white pickup truck, my hands started shaking. I sat in my car for almost an hour, trying to figure out what to do next. Part of me wanted to march up to whatever cabin she was in and confront them both. Part of me wanted to drive home and pretend I'd never seen any of this. But mostly, I just felt empty. Eventually, I checked into a small motel about 10 miles away and spent the night staring at the ceiling, wondering how my life had gotten to this point. Saturday morning brought the first real twist I hadn't seen coming. I was sitting in a diner near the motel, picking at a plate of eggs I couldn't taste, when an older man at the counter started talking to the waitress about the resort where my wife was staying. He mentioned that his daughter worked there in the office, and she'd told him about some drama they'd had recently with guests. I couldn't help but listen as he explained that they'd had to ask someone to leave the previous month because other guests had complained about noise and inappropriate behavior. Apparently, it wasn't the first time they'd had problems with this particular guest, a middle-aged man who'd been bringing different women there for months, always booking under fake names, always paying cash. My blood ran cold. I asked the waitress if she knew anything more about it, pretending to be concerned about the safety of the resort since I was thinking of booking a stay there myself. She said her friend who worked the front desk had mentioned that the guy was some kind of teacher or professor, real smooth talker, but that they'd finally banned him after the last incident. A teacher, a professor. I drove back to the resort with my heart hammering in my chest. This time, I didn't just sit in the parking lot. I walked into the main office and asked to speak with the manager. I explained that I was concerned about my wife's safety. She'd mentioned meeting someone here, and I'd heard there had been some problems with a previous guest. The manager, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, looked uncomfortable but seemed to understand my concern. She couldn't give me specific details about other guests, but she did confirm that they'd recently had to ban someone who'd been causing problems. She described him as manipulative, someone who seemed to prey on women who were going through difficult times in their marriages. That's when she said something that made my world tilt sideways. He told our staff he was some kind of counselor or therapist, said he was helping these women work through their problems. But we could tell it was just a line he used. A counselor, a therapist, a professor. Suddenly, pieces of a puzzle I didn't even know existed started falling into place. Update 2. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing through memories I was now seeing in an entirely different light. My wife dropping out of college suddenly during her junior year, claiming she was having mental health issues and needed to take a break. Her reluctance to ever talk about that time in her life, how she'd changed the subject whenever I asked about her college experience. The way she'd always been vague about why she'd never gone back to finish her degree. That night, after she returned from her supposed conference with stories about boring presentations and bad hotel coffee, I waited until she was asleep and then did something I'd never done in 8 years of marriage. I went through her personal things. In a box at the back of her closet, underneath old photo albums and college notebooks, I found what I was looking for. A folder full of papers from her college years, including transcripts, course schedules, and correspondence with the administration. And there it was, documentation of a complaint she'd filed against a professor during her junior year. The complaint was vague, carefully worded, but it painted a picture of inappropriate conduct and abuse of authority. The professor's name was right there in black and white, and it matched the first name the park ranger had mentioned. The same man she'd been camping with, the same man she'd been spending weekends with at romantic resorts. But here's where the story took another turn that left me reeling. The complaint had been withdrawn. According to the paperwork, my wife had requested that the investigation be dropped and had left school voluntarily shortly after. There was a letter from the administration expressing their regret that she felt she needed to leave and offering her support if she ever wanted to return. I spent the rest of the night reading through everything in that box. Old journals from her college years painted a picture of a young woman who'd been struggling with confidence and direction. There were entries about a professor who'd taken special interest in her, who'd made her feel smart and special, who'd convinced her that she was too good for the regular curriculum. The entries started innocent enough, staying after class to discuss assignments, extra credit projects, intellectual conversations that made her feel mature and sophisticated. But gradually, they became more personal. The professor sharing details about his unhappy marriage, making her feel like a confidant, like someone who understood him in a way his wife never could. And then the entry stopped abruptly. No explanation, no final entry describing what had happened. Just blank pages for the rest of the journal. Now I understood why she'd never talked about college, why she'd always claimed her mental health issues were too personal to discuss. She hadn't dropped out because of depression or anxiety. She dropped out because she'd gotten involved with a professor who'd manipulated her, and when things had gone wrong, she'd felt like she had no choice but to leave. But what I couldn't understand was why she was with him again now. Had he contacted her somehow? Had she reached out to him? How long had this been going on? And what did it mean for our marriage, for our family? I confronted her the next morning after the kids left for school. I didn't ease into it, or try to be diplomatic. I put the phone records on the kitchen table, along with some of the college paperwork I'd found. Her face went through about 5 different expressions in the span of 10 seconds. Confusion, recognition, panic, anger, and finally something that looked almost like relief. She sat down heavily in one of our kitchen chairs and put her head in her hands. What she told me next was somehow worse than anything I'd imagined. He'd contacted her about a year ago through social media. Just a simple message saying he'd been thinking about his former students and wondering how she was doing. She'd been going through a rough patch, feeling stuck in our routine, struggling with the fact that she'd never finished college, wondering what her life might have been like if things had been different. His messages had been supportive, understanding. He'd apologized for how things had ended in college, said he'd always regretted that she'd felt the need to leave school. He'd convinced her that they could be friends now, that enough time had passed for them to have a healthy relationship. The emotional affair had started slowly, long text conversations about books and ideas, phone calls when I was at work or asleep. He'd made her feel intellectual again, special, like she had potential she'd never fulfilled. He'd also been going through a divorce, he told her, and needed someone who understood what it was like to feel trapped in a life that didn't fit anymore. When he'd suggested meeting in person, she'd hesitated. She knew it was wrong, knew it was dangerous. But he'd been patient, persuasive. He'd suggested camping, something innocent, outdoors, just 2 old friends reconnecting with nature and having deep conversations. She swore the physical relationship had only started recently, but I could see in her eyes that wasn't the whole truth. What hurt the most was her explanation for why she'd continued seeing him even after that first camping trip. She said he made her feel like the person she was supposed to be. With him, she wasn't just a wife and mother stuck in suburban routine. She was interesting, intelligent, worthy of deep conversation and romantic gestures. He saw potential in her that she'd forgotten she had. I asked her if she loved him, and her silence was answer enough. But then came the biggest twist of all, the one that changed everything I thought I understood about the situation. She started crying and told me there was something else I needed to know. Something about why she'd really left college. Something she'd never told anyone, not even the administration when she'd filed that complaint. She'd been pregnant. The affair with her professor had resulted in a pregnancy that she'd terminated without telling anyone, including him. The guilt and shame had been overwhelming. She'd felt like she couldn't face going back to classes, seeing him every day, pretending nothing had happened. So she'd filed a vague complaint hoping the administration would handle it quietly. And when they'd started asking for details she didn't want to give, she'd withdrawn everything and left school. She'd met me 6 months later, when she was still raw and broken from the whole experience. I'd represented stability, kindness, a chance at a normal life. She'd convinced herself that what had happened in college was a mistake, a learning experience that had led her to where she was supposed to be. But when he'd contacted her again, all those old feelings had come rushing back. Not just the attraction, but the guilt, the unfinished business, the sense that she'd never properly dealt with what had happened between them. She said she'd been planning to end it after this last weekend. She'd realized that being with him again wasn't healing old wounds. It was creating new ones. She could see how the lies were destroying our family, how the guilt was eating her alive. But she also said she wasn't sure she could go back to the way things were before. The affair had shown her parts of herself she'd forgotten existed, and she didn't know how to reconcile the person she was with him with the person she was with me. I listened to all of this sitting at our kitchen table, surrounded by the ordinary details of our shared life. Kids' school papers on the counter, coffee mugs we'd used every morning for years, a grocery list in her handwriting stuck to the refrigerator. The contrast between the mundane setting and the earth-shattering conversation was almost surreal. When she finished talking, we sat in silence for a long time. I could hear the neighbor's dog barking, a lawnmower starting up somewhere down the street, all the normal sounds of a Tuesday morning in suburbia. But nothing felt normal anymore. She asked me what I wanted to do, whether I thought we could work through it. I told her I honestly didn't know. The betrayal was devastating, but understanding the history behind it added layers of complexity I hadn't expected. This wasn't just about her having an affair. It was about unresolved trauma, about parts of her identity she'd buried for years, about the ways people can be shaped by experiences they never fully process. I also realized that our marriage had been built on a foundation I hadn't fully understood. She'd never told me about the pregnancy, about the real reason she'd left school. I'd fallen in love with someone who was still healing from something she couldn't name, and maybe she'd never had the chance to figure out who she really was outside of that experience. Over the next few days, we had long, difficult conversations about what came next. She agreed to cut off all contact with him immediately, but she also said she needed time to figure out who she was and what she wanted. I said I needed time too, to process what I'd learned, to decide whether I could forgive her, to figure out if we could rebuild something real from what felt like the ruins of our relationship. We agreed to tell the kids that we were taking some time apart to work on some grown-up problems, nothing they had caused or needed to worry about. She moved in with her sister temporarily, and I tried to navigate single parenting while processing the emotional upheaval of everything I'd discovered. Final update. It's been 3 months since that conversation in our kitchen, and I'm writing this final update because I think I've finally reached some kind of resolution, though not the one I expected when this all started. The first few weeks after she moved out were brutal. I was angry, hurt, confused, and overwhelmed trying to manage everything on my own. The kids kept asking when Mom was coming home, and I struggled to explain the situation in age-appropriate terms. I found myself swinging between wanting to fight for our marriage and wanting to file for divorce immediately. About a month in, something unexpected happened. She called me one evening, sobbing, and said she needed to tell me something else. He had contacted her again, despite her promise to cut off communication. But instead of trying to convince her to see him, he'd been angry about her decision to work on our marriage. He'd said things that made her realize how manipulative and controlling he really was. She'd finally seen him clearly, not as the romantic figure from her college memories or the understanding friend who'd reached out when she was vulnerable, but as someone who preyed on women during difficult periods in their lives. She realized that both times she'd been involved with him, she'd been at low points, searching for something she felt was missing. That realization had been devastating, but also liberating. For the first time, she could see the pattern clearly, how he'd positioned himself as someone who understood her better than anyone else, how he'd made her feel special while also making her feel like she couldn't trust her own judgment about other relationships. She asked if she could come home, said she was ready to do whatever it took to rebuild our marriage. But something had shifted in me during those weeks alone. I'd gotten used to a different rhythm of life, had time to think about what I actually wanted rather than just reacting to the crisis. I told her I wasn't ready for her to come home yet, that I needed more time to process everything. She was disappointed, but said she understood. During this time, I'd been doing my own work trying to understand how we'd gotten to this point. I'd started paying attention to the ways I'd maybe contributed to her feelings of being stuck or unfulfilled. Not that I was responsible for her choices, but I could see how we'd fallen into routines that didn't leave much room for growth or deep connection. I'd also been thinking about the person I'd become over the years, focused on work and practical concerns, maybe not as emotionally available as I could have been. I'd assumed our marriage was solid because we didn't fight much and got along well, but I hadn't been paying attention to whether we were both truly happy. After about 2 months of separation, we started meeting regularly to talk, not about logistics or the kids, but about deeper things. What we'd both been feeling in our marriage before the affair started. What we'd learned about ourselves during this crisis. Whether we thought we could build something better together. These conversations were different from any we'd had during our marriage. More honest, more vulnerable, less focused on maintaining harmony and more focused on understanding each other. I started to see sides of her I'd forgotten existed. Her intelligence, her curiosity about ideas, her need for intellectual stimulation that I'd somehow stopped noticing. She started to understand how her secrecy and lies had affected me, how the betrayal had shaken my trust not just in her, but in my own ability to read situations and people. She could see that rebuilding wouldn't just be about her proving she could be faithful, but about both of us learning to communicate differently. About a month ago, we made a decision that surprised both of us. Instead of her moving back home immediately, we decided to start dating again. Literally dating, planned activities, time together without the kids, conversations about things other than household management and schedules. It felt strange at first, almost like we were pretending to be people we weren't. But gradually, it started to feel like we were rediscovering parts of ourselves and each other that had gotten buried under years of routine. Last week, she moved back home. Not because we'd solved everything, but because we both felt ready to try building something new together. We're different people than we were 6 months ago, and our relationship is different too. The kids were thrilled to have her back, and honestly, it felt good to be a family again. But we're also realistic about the work ahead of us. Trust doesn't rebuild overnight, and we both have to stay committed to the kind of communication and attention to each other that we'd let slide before. She's also decided to go back to school to finish her degree. Not because she feels like she has to prove something, but because our conversations helped her realize she'd never dealt with feeling like her education was incomplete. She wants to reclaim that part of her identity on her own terms. I'm proud of her for that decision, and I'm also proud of us for finding a way through this crisis that didn't involve just trying to go back to the way things were before. What we had before wasn't strong enough to prevent this from happening, so going back wasn't really an option. I still have moments of anger and hurt about the affair. Probably always will. But I also have moments of gratitude for what we learned about ourselves and each other through this painful process. We're more honest with each other now, more intentional about staying connected, more aware of the work that good relationships require. The man who manipulated my wife, who preyed on her vulnerability both in college and again years later, is no longer part of our story. She's blocked him on everything, and more importantly, she understands now how he was able to manipulate her both times. That understanding feels like protection against it happening again. Our marriage isn't the same as it was before this all started. In some ways, it's more fragile. We both know now that it's not indestructible, that it requires attention and care to survive. But in other ways, it's stronger because it's based on a deeper understanding of who we both really are. I'm not writing this to say that everyone should try to work through infidelity, or that affairs can somehow make marriages stronger. Every situation is different, and there were specific circumstances in our case that made rebuilding feel possible and worthwhile. But I am writing this to say that sometimes the worst things that happen to us can also be doorways to understanding parts of ourselves and our relationships that we'd never examined before. The affair was devastating, but it also forced us both to confront truths about ourselves and our marriage that we'd been avoiding for years. I don't know what the future holds for us. We're taking things one day at a time, staying committed to the hard work of rebuilding trust and maintaining the deeper level of connection we've discovered. Some days are better than others, but we're both in it for the long haul. The forest ranger who called me that Sunday morning probably had no idea that his phone call would set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately save my marriage. At the time, it felt like the worst news I could possibly receive. Now I see it as the wake-up call we both needed, even though neither of us knew it at the time. Sometimes the truth hurts before it heals, but it's still better than living with lies.